I used to think that ghosts were just a myth, a product of an overactive imagination. That was until I started working at Hillview Manor. It was a nursing home that had been converted from a tuberculosis hospital. I was hired as a night shift nurse, tasked with caring for the elderly patients who resided there. At first, everything was fine. It was a peaceful and quiet place, and I enjoyed getting to know the residents. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice strange things happening at night. Doors would open and close on their own, and I would hear footsteps echoing through the halls when there was no one else around. The air felt thick and heavy, as though something was always lurking just out of sight. One night, I was sitting in the nurse's station, filling out some paperwork, when I heard a voice call my name. I looked up, but there was no one there. I assumed it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. It was a soft, whispery voice that seemed to be coming from down the hall. I got up to investigate, and as I made my way down the dark hallway, I heard the voice again, louder this time. It was a woman's voice, and she sounded scared. I rounded the corner and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was an elderly woman, dressed in a hospital gown, with a look of terror on her face. I asked her if she was okay, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me. I took a step closer, and suddenly, she vanished into thin air. From that night on, I was convinced that the nursing home was haunted. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but then the strange occurrences became more frequent. I would hear the sound of a piano playing in an empty room, and the smell of lavender would fill the air, even though there were no flowers around. One night, as I was helping an elderly resident to the bathroom, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure, standing in the doorway of an empty room. I tried to ignore it, but I could feel its presence, watching me. I began to dread going to work, knowing that I would have to face the fear and uncertainty of what lay within those walls. The other nurses would brush off my concerns, telling me that it was just my imagination, but I knew that something was not right. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a loud crash coming from the end of the hallway. I ran towards the sound, and when I arrived, I saw that a heavy metal cart had been knocked over. But there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that I had to leave that place. I resigned from my position the following day, but the memories of my time at Hillview Manor still haunt me. I can't shake the feeling that the spirits of the former patients are still wandering the halls, lost and alone. I've tried to tell my friends and family about my experiences, but they dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw and heard. I know that the Hillview Manor is haunted, and I will never forget the fear and uncertainty that I felt while working there. Years have passed since I worked at Hillview Manor, but the memories still haunt me. It wasn't until recently that I discovered the truth about the history of the building and the horrors that occurred within its walls. After my experience, I started doing research on the nursing home and its past. It was then that I discovered that the building was originally a tuberculosis hospital in the early 1900s. Thousands of patients had been admitted, and many of them had died within its walls. As I delved deeper into the history, I uncovered something even more sinister. In the 1950s, the hospital was converted into a nursing home, but the conditions were appalling. Patients were neglected and left to suffer, often in their own waste. Many of them died from infections and diseases caused by the unsanitary conditions. It was no wonder that the spirits of the former patients were still wandering the halls of Hillview Manor. They were trapped there, unable to move on from the horrors they had experienced. But the more I researched, the more I discovered that there was something else lurking within the walls of Hillview Manor. There were rumors of a doctor who had conducted experiments on the patients, using them as guinea pigs for his twisted experiments. It was said that he had gone mad, driven to insanity by the horrors he had inflicted upon the patients. As I read through the accounts of former staff members and patients, I realized that the figure I had seen in the hallway that night was likely the ghost of that deranged doctor. His experiments had left a lasting imprint on the building, and his spirit still roamed the halls, searching for new victims. I shuddered at the thought of the evil that still lingered within the walls of Hillview Manor. It was clear to me that the nursing home should never have been built on such a dark and twisted history. The spirits of the patients and the doctor would never find peace, and the building would forever be a place of fear and terror. I knew then that I had to warn others of the true horrors that lay within Hillview Manor. I wrote about my experiences and the dark history of the building, hoping to bring awareness to the atrocities that had occurred within its walls. But even as I write this, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I know that the spirits of Hillview Manor are still out there, waiting for their next victim. And as long as the building stands, their presence will continue to haunt those who dare to enter its doors. I had always been fascinated by the abandoned asylum on the edge of town. It had been closed for years, ever since a scandal rocked the facility and it was forced to shut down. But I had heard rumors that there was still something lurking within those walls. One night, I decided to gather some friends and explore the abandoned building. It was a foolish idea, I knew, but the lure of the unknown was too strong to resist. As we made our way through the overgrown courtyard, I felt a sense of unease settle on my stomach. The building looked even more ominous up close, with broken windows and crumbling brickwork. But we pushed on, eager to see what secrets lay within. We made our way through the dark, dank hallways, our flashlights illuminating the way. The air was thick with dust and decay, and I could hear the sound of rats scurrying through the walls. It was a chilling, eerie feeling, and I was beginning to regret our decision to explore the abandoned asylum. As we turned a corner, our flashlights caught a glimpse of movement. We froze, unsure of what we had just seen. But then we heard a faint whisper, coming from deep within the asylum. It was a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart was pounding in my chest as we cautiously moved towards the source of the whisper. It led us to a door that was partially ajar, and we could see a flickering light coming from within. It was a small room, and as we peered inside, we saw an old man huddled in the corner, his eyes wild with fear. He looked up at us with a desperate look in his eyes and told us to leave, that the asylum was not a safe place. But then he whispered something that made my blood run cold. He said that there was something evil lurking within the walls of the asylum, a force that had been awakened by our intrusion. As we tried to leave the asylum, we found that all the doors were locked from the outside. It was as though someone, or something, was trying to keep us trapped inside. We were trapped, with no way out. We made our way back to the small room, the old man still huddled in the corner. He told us that we needed to find the key to the door that would lead us out of the asylum. But it was hidden, and we would have to search the dark, twisting corridors to find it. As we made our way through the asylum, we could feel the presence of something watching us. It was a malevolent force, and I knew that we were not alone. We searched room after room, our fear growing with each passing moment. Finally, we found the key, hidden in a small cabinet in one of the abandoned offices. We made our way back to the small room, and the old man showed us the door that led to our escape. As we stepped out into the night, we could hear the sounds of something chasing us from within the asylum. We ran, our hearts pounding, until we were far away from the abandoned asylum. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out into the night. It was a fear that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a fear of the unknown and the darkness that lurks within the abandoned asylum. As we caught our breaths, we realized that we had made a grave mistake by entering the abandoned asylum. We had awakened something sinister, and it had followed us out into the world. For days, I could feel its presence lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. I heard whispers in my ear and felt cold fingers brushing against my skin. It was a presence that I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. I went to see the old man in the hopes that he could shed some light on what was happening to me. But when I arrived at the asylum, I found that the building had been sealed off. There was no trace of the old man or the key that had led us to safety. I was alone with the malevolent force that had followed me out of the asylum. It seemed to feed on my fear, growing stronger with each passing day. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew that it was real and that it was coming for me. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was the voice of the old man from the abandoned asylum, and he told me that there was a way to defeat the malevolent force. But it would require a sacrifice that I was not sure I was willing to make. I spent days trying to figure out what the old man had meant, and it was only when I was at my lowest point that I realized what needed to be done. I had to face my fear head-on, to confront the malevolent force and banish it from my life forever. I returned to the abandoned asylum, armed with nothing but my courage and determination. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sound of something moving in the darkness made my heart skip a beat. But I pushed on, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. As I reached the room where I had first encountered the malevolent force, I could feel its presence growing stronger. But I refused to back down, and I stood my ground as it came at me with all its might. I screamed as I banished the force from my life, feeling a sense of relief wash over me as it dissipated into the ether. And as I made my way out of the abandoned asylum, I knew that I had conquered my fear, and that I would never be afraid of the darkness again. Many years ago, my mom was working as a mental health nurse in an institution. She had a patient that was usually lovely, and so one-to-one care was fine. One day my mom took this patient for a bath. It was a routine part of her job, but little did she know that this particular bath would haunt her for the rest of her life. The patient, who we'll call Mary, seemed happy and calm at first, but as my mom started to help her undress, she noticed something wasn't quite right. Mary had a strange look in her eye, like she was seeing something that wasn't there. My mom tried to brush it off, but as she helped Mary into the bath, she suddenly snapped. Mary's demeanor changed in an instant. She became aggressive and started attacking my mom, trying to scratch and bite her. My mom was shocked and terrified, but managed to get Mary under control and out of the bath. She quickly dressed her and took her back to her room, where she reported the incident to her colleagues. From that day on, my mom was never quite the same. She became more reserved and quiet, and had trouble sleeping. She was haunted by the look in Mary's eyes and the violence she had shown towards her. She didn't know what had triggered it, but she knew it wasn't something she could just forget about. A few days later, my mom was back on shift and everything seemed to be back to normal. Mary was still in her room, but my mom was able to avoid her for the most part. However, as the day went on, strange things began to happen. Doors started slamming shut, and items started moving on their own. My mom and her colleagues were all terrified, but they tried to keep calm and carry on with their duties. That night, my mom was walking through the empty corridors when she heard a noise coming from Mary's room. She cautiously approached the door and peered inside. To her horror, Mary was lying on the bed, surrounded by what appeared to be hundreds of spiders. The room was covered in webs, and the spiders were crawling all over Mary's body. My mom ran out of the room and immediately called for help. When her colleagues arrived, they found Mary lying on the bed, completely unresponsive. They rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. Mary had died, and my mom was left to deal with the trauma of what she had witnessed. Years later, my mom told me this story, and it still sends shivers down my spine. She was never able to explain what had caused Mary's sudden outburst or the strange events that followed. But one thing was for sure, the experience had changed her forever. She quit her job soon after and never returned to work in mental health. To this day, I can't help but wonder what really happened in that hospital. Was Mary possessed by some supernatural force? Or was it simply a case of a mental health patient having a bad day? Whatever the explanation, I know one thing for sure. My mom's experience in that hospital was one of the scariest things I've ever heard.